The Vanished House. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm, but when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing, turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared.
Peppa Pig, the new neighbor. It all began early one morning. The sky was gray and the wind was driving dry leaves down the street. Peppa walked to the window and suddenly stopped. Out on the empty lot behind their house stood a house. Old, gray, with a sagging roof, but that lot had always been empty. Peppa was sure of it. "Mummy, Daddy!" she called. "Where did that house come from?" Mummy poured tea and Daddy flipped through his newspaper. "It's always been there, Peppa," said Daddy, too quickly, too calmly. Peppa frowned but said nothing. That day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden, and that's when they saw him for the first time. Standing behind the fence was a wolf, but not an ordinary one. His fur was snow white, almost glowing against the gray sky. His eyes black, without any shine, and his smile too straight, too empty of any real feeling. He simply stood there, silently staring at them. George huddled behind her. "Hello," the wolf finally said. His voice was strange, dry, like crunching snow. The next day, the white wolf stood by their gate. Daddy went out and shook his paw. Mummy invited him into the house. Peppa stayed back, feeling her hooves tense. "Who is that?" she asked. "Our old friend," Mummy said, smiling a little too widely. "You know him." But Peppa didn't know him. She was certain she didn't. On the third day, the white wolf sat with them at breakfast. He ate his porridge slowly. He didn't blink. His movements were too precise, like a wind-up toy. Whenever he looked at Peppa, she felt a cold chill run down her back. His paws were thin, too long for a normal wolf, and when he set down his spoon, the table creaked under his touch. On the fourth day, Peppa woke to the creaking of the floorboards. She opened her eyes. The white wolf stood in the doorway. His white fur glowed softly in the dim light of the room. He simply stood and stared. His shadow stretched in a long line across the floor to her bed. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them again, he was gone. But the door remained wide open. On the fifth day, strange changes began around the house. In the family photographs, someone new had appeared. A tall, blurred figure with a white patch where the face should be. His paw rested on Peppa's and George's shoulders. Their smiles in the pictures were too wide, drawn on almost. When Peppa finally gathered her courage and asked, "Why is he living with us?" Daddy calmly replied, "Peppa, he's always been part of our family." And Daddy said it as if he barely believed it himself. On the sixth night, Peppa and George decided to run away. They crept down the stairs, quietly opened the front door, but outside, there was no street, no garden, only thick white fog stretching endlessly into the distance. and in that fog shadows moved, tall, twisted. When they turned around, the white wolf was already behind them. He was closer than ever before. He slowly tilted his head to the side and whispered, "Home is where you are always expected." His voice was a whisper, scratching at the air. Peppa and George clung tightly to each other. The next morning, the Pig family's house looked normal. Mummy set the table, Daddy read his newspaper, but in every family photograph now there were 5 figures, and in every window, if you looked closely, you could see a tall white figure standing just behind, and dark eyes staring straight at you, never blinking.
Peppa Pig. The parents have changed. One evening, Peppa's family gathered for dinner. Everything seemed normal. Daddy Pig told funny stories, and Mummy Pig served their favorite meals. But something felt off. Peppa noticed her parents were unusually quiet as they ate, their gazes strangely empty. "Mummy, are you okay?" Peppa asked. "Of course, dear," Mummy Pig replied, but her voice was soft and lifeless. Daddy Pig smiled, but his smile was too wide, almost like it was painted on. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, as if someone was pacing back and forth. She woke George, and together they crept out of their room. Downstairs, in the dark living room, they saw their parents standing motionless. Mummy and Daddy Pig stared at a single point, as though they were waiting for something. "Mummy! Daddy!" Peppa called, but they didn't respond. Suddenly, Daddy Pig turned his head, his eyes completely black. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice echoing and hollow. The children ran back to their room, trembling with fear. The next day, their parents acted even stranger. Mummy Pig didn't cook breakfast. She just sat at the table, drumming her fingers slowly. Daddy Pig stared out the window, ignoring the children's attempts to talk to him. "What's wrong with you?" Peppa finally yelled. Daddy Pig turned to her slowly, his smile stretching wider, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. "We're fine, Peppa. Are you?" That evening, the children once again heard footsteps. Peeking out, they saw their parents descending into the basement, a place that was usually locked. The basement door was slightly ajar, and a strange, low hum came from within. "We have to see what they're doing," Peppa whispered. The children carefully followed them down the stairs. Inside, they found Mummy and Daddy Pig standing in front of a large black mirror. Their reflections moved independently, as though alive. "Soon they'll be part of the house, too," Mummy Pig said, her voice sounding unnatural. Daddy Pig turned toward the children, his face twisted into a horrifying grin. "Join us," he said, stepping forward. Peppa and George ran back upstairs, but the hallways stretched endlessly. The walls seemed to shift and close in on them, as though the house itself was alive. "You can't escape," Daddy Pig's voice echoed throughout the house.
Peppa Pig, the Attic. It all started on a gloomy morning. Rain tapped quietly against the windows, and the air felt heavy. Peppa was walking down the hallway when she suddenly looked up. In the middle of the ceiling there was a wooden hatch. Dusty, handleless. It definitely hadn't been there before. Peppa froze. "Daddy, Mummy, what's that?" Daddy was the first to come over. He stared up for a long time. "Maybe it's always been there," he said, but his voice wavered. Mummy simply nodded and walked into the kitchen. The next day, Peppa dragged out a stepladder. George held it steady at the bottom, clutching his dinosaur toy. Peppa carefully climbed up and pulled the ring. The hatch opened with a creak. A cold, musty, dusty smell wafted out. "Let's go and see," said Peppa. George hesitated but followed her. They climbed up inside. Above them was the attic, dark, wide, windowless. All around lay old things, torn toys, crooked cupboards, cracked mirrors. Dust floated thickly in the air like fog. The floor creaked under their feet. When Peppa called out, "Mummy? Daddy?" there was no answer, not a sound. Only the heavy, muffled silence. They decided to go back. Peppa looked around. Where the hatch to the hallway floor should have been, where they had just climbed up, there was now only a solid, dusty board. No hole, no hatch, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, "Mommy! Daddy! Help!" No answer, only the cold of the attic and endless emptiness stretching around them. They walked forward, holding hands tightly. Sometimes, among the junk in the darkness, strange objects appeared: broken strollers, mirrors without reflections, dolls without faces. At one point, they spotted a box. Written on it in chalk were the words, "Do not open." They carefully walked around it, but Peppa felt something watching them from inside the box. In the distance, they heard voices. Mummy's voice. "Peppa, breakfast is ready." Daddy's voice. "Where are our little ones?" Peppa gripped George's hoof tighter. "Mummy, Daddy, we're here." But the voices sounded hollow, like an old broken recording. No real answer. They kept walking, and time lost all meaning. Sometimes at the edges of their vision, shapes flickered, tall, thin, but when they looked directly, nothing was there. On the fourth day, they found a mirror. Peppa approached it. Their reflections moved with a slight delay. Their faces were slightly distorted, and behind them, in the mirror, stood a shadow. Sometimes they heard footsteps behind them, software almost silent, but when they turned around, no one was there. On the seventh day, they saw a staircase, lit by a faint, pale light. They ran toward it, climbed up, and found themselves back in the same attic, darker, colder, even emptier, and next to them stood a box. On it was written, "For the new ones." From the depths of the attic came a rustling sound, slow, approaching. Peppa and George huddled close together, and in the silence, a whisper came. "Now you are part of the house." Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy set 2 cups on the table. "Children, breakfast," she called. Daddy glanced at the clock and shrugged. "They must be playing outside," he said. And no one ever mentioned the strange hatch in the ceiling again, or the stepladder, or the voices. And at night, if you listened very carefully, you could hear the soft tapping of little hooves and the creaking of an old board somewhere high, high above the ceiling.
This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Uncontrollable Growth. It was an ordinary evening in the pig household. The sun was setting, casting warm rays through the windows of the living room. Peppa and George were sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of fairy tales their mother had given them. The atmosphere was calm, almost too perfect. But deep inside Peppa, a strange feeling began to build, as if something wasn't quite right. She put the book down and stretched, gazing out the window. The sky had turned darker, taking on a purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But as she stared at the darkening sky, she felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her heart had skipped a beat. It felt like some sort of pressure, almost as if she felt uncomfortably full. Peppa stood up, rubbing her stomach. It felt like she had overeaten at dinner, but that wasn't the case. Her clothes started to feel tight. The sensation of pressure grew stronger, and she noticed something even stranger. She was growing. At first, it was only a little bit. Her legs tingled and her shoes started to feel tight, but she brushed it off as a trick of the mind. However, the strange feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it only intensified. Her legs began to stretch. Peppa looked down in horror as her legs grew longer and her pants tightened around her body. She gasped, trying to call for her parents, but her voice sounded muffled, as though something was blocking it. And then she kept growing. Her legs stretched further and her body seemed to expand faster and faster. She could feel her arms and head elongating. She reached for the walls, but each movement made her grow even more. Peppa panicked, trying to steady herself, but with every step, she just got bigger. Soon she was taller than the house, and everything around her felt tighter. The ceiling cracked as her head scraped against it. The walls closed in around her, and Peppa couldn't comprehend what was happening. The world around her seemed so small. Even the floor, which had once felt solid, began to crack under her growing weight. With every step, Peppa became bigger, and it was harder and harder to control her body. Her movements were slow and clumsy, and she felt more out of control with each passing second. The furniture fell apart, the walls crumbled, and she couldn't stop growing. Everything around her felt smaller, and she felt like a giant moving through a tiny world. Peppa looked around in horror, trying to make sense of it all, but with each moment she felt more helpless. Her body, once light and agile, was now heavy and uncontrollable. She tried to crouch down, but her massive body didn't obey her. Her clothes and the walls around her squeezed in, and she continued to grow, unable to stop herself. As she was nearly bursting through the roof, she felt the house begin to collapse. The walls broke apart, and the ceiling flew off as if made of cards. Peppa stood there, her gigantic body blocking out everything. What was once her home was now destroyed and gone, crushed under the weight of her own growth. She sat in complete silence, surrounded by the ruins of the house, unable to understand how to return to her original size. Her body didn't obey her, and the world around her seemed too tiny and fragile.
Peppa Pig. Soft Daddy. The morning began as usual. Rain tapped on the roof and the windows were gray with mist. The kitchen smelled like toast. Daddy Pig entered the room, moving a little slower than normal, rubbing his neck. He sat down at the table, not just heavily but softly, as if his body gave way like dough. Peppa looked at him more closely. When he smiled, his cheek didn't return to its normal shape. It stayed slightly pressed down, as if it had stuck to his chin. Mummy poured tea. George played with his toy dinosaur. No one said anything, but Peppa noticed. When Daddy picked up his cup, his hoof bent slightly unnaturally. It trembled like jelly. All day Daddy moved slowly. He barely spoke, and in the evening he sat in the armchair, staring at the wall, unblinking. When Mummy called him for dinner, he didn't answer right away. Then he stood up. But what rose from the chair wasn't quite him. It was something like him. His body peeled away from the backrest with a wet sound. On the fabric remained a mark, like a plasticine print. He walked to the table, stopped, then turned and silently went upstairs. The next morning, Daddy didn't come down. Peppa and George sat at the table. Mummy went to check. The bedroom was dark, even though the window was open. Daddy Pig sat on the edge of the bed, gently rocking back and forth. He no longer looked like Daddy. His shape was almost the same, but too round. His face, slightly crooked, like someone had tried to copy it from memory. Eyes, cloudy, glassy. Lips, trembling, though he said nothing. Mummy called his name gently. He turned his head slowly in jerks and stood up. When he stepped forward, one foot sank into the floor and stayed there until it peeled free with a wet stretch. He didn't attack. He just walked, quietly, without a sound, straight toward her. Mummy stepped back, closed the door. Later the house grew colder. The smell, sweet, like melted wax. On the hallway floor appeared smeared footprints. George found Daddy's glasses in the corner. They were soft, almost warm. Daddy Pig never opened the door again, but he was still in the house. Sometimes there were soft, wet footsteps, a heavy creaking, long, deep breaths. And then he came out. Not from the room, from the wall. A curve of pink mass slowly slid across the floor, echoing his shape. No legs, no hooves, no neck, just mass. Pink, warm, breathing. Peppa and George ran to Mummy. They slammed the living room door and braced it with a chair. But something sticky was already oozing through the gap beneath the door. They ran upstairs, but the house grew quieter. Too quiet. Daddy was spreading. He didn't want to talk anymore. He wanted to be together, in one body, no forms, no names. The next day, the house was calm, everything looked normal, clean, silent, only the floor glistened, the walls slightly damp. On the kitchen table stood 2 teacups and 1 ribbon. On the floor, a smooth, even stain. In the very center, a pair of glasses. No one entered that house again, but if you stand by the door and listen, you might hear a breath, slow, deep, as if something is waiting.